So I'll give everyone just one more minute. It is 4 on the nose, and it should be quite an interesting talk today, where thankfully I have a guest speaker who will help us, who a lot of you know. Not all of you know her, because some of you are from around all over South Africa, but I'll introduce in a second. Tali, thank you for being here. Can you hear me, Tali?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect, perfect.
Right.
Okie dokie. So Tali, pretty much, I'm going to be letting people in, you know, as people come, and this will also be shared online. So I'll share with you the link once it goes on. So beware, you are being recorded. Okay, but don't be scared. Don't be scared. Okay, so today is the second part of the universe series. According to the structure of the 7 days of creation, we spoke about light already. And today we're going to be doing water. Thankfully, I've asked Tali Brooke, who is somewhat of an expert. I know she doesn't like me saying that, but she has various degrees and definitely years of experience with different things with regards to water, which I'll ask her to discuss with us in a few minutes. I'm just going to give over the first maybe 5 minutes, Tali, and the last maybe 5 minutes, just to get people thinking about water. I'm personally more interested in what you have to say, because what you have to say is very relevant and real. I'm going to be talking more just in a conceptual level about water, and then we'll take the concept down. Just like water flows down, we'll take it down into the practical bites and bits that need to be discussed. First thing is, very interesting, the word water in Hebrew is mayim, which is a mem, a yud, and a mem. In English, you call that a palindrome. It goes from one way to the other. Very versatile word, this word mayim. Just like water is very free-flowing. Sometimes it goes this way, sometimes it goes that way. The most fascinating thing that I think about this word mayim in Hebrew is that in English, you call water, in science, H2O. You've got 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. Here you've got 2 mems, 1 yud. I find that very fascinating in the word itself, once we discovered H2O. The Torah itself doesn't mention the creation of water, which is so interesting. When you look at the Torah, it says, and let there be light, and there was light. Whereas when it comes to water, it just assumes that the water was already there. That's another fascinating question to think about. Why doesn't the Torah mention the creation of the water? It almost assumes that it's there. On a scientific level, hydrogen is the most common element of all in the Milky Way, is hydrogen. Oxygen, I believe, is number 3. So we've got the first and the third elements which make up water, which are the most common elements in the universe, or at least in the Milky Way. That also gets you to think about, wow, you know, most things are made from hydrogens and waters. It seems that this universe is water. You don't need to look further than the Milky Way. You just look at this Earth. This Earth is 70% water, approximately. A human body is approximately 70% body weight. It depends on what age you are. We start off much higher at like 75% plus. And as we get older, it goes down to maybe 55%. But let's call it on average, our water percentage in our body is the same water percentage in the world. It also gets you to think about, whoa, there's something weird going on, that most things are made from hydrogen and oxygen, and it's the most, you know, common thing out there, and we ourselves are made from it. I've mentioned once before that there was a Japanese doctor or pseudo-doctor, depends who you're talking to. His name was Dr. Masaru Emoto, and he claimed to do all these tests in Petri dishes by taking water, talking to it, talking bad things to it, talking nice things to it, etc., etc., and then he froze it. and he noticed that the ones that you spoke nicely to had nice little crystal flakes, perfect crystals, whereas the ones that you spoke negatively to had all disjointed figurations and permutations of how the molecules looked under the microscope. And he came up with this idea that water has consciousness, that water can actually understand how we are, relating to it. I noticed, I did a little bit of research on this. I noticed that there was a Bar Ilan student university in Israel who took it to the next level. I'm just going to mute everyone, and then Tali, just unmute yourself when you talk. There was a student at Bar Ilan University who took this professor from Japan's experiment, and instead of talking nice to it and not nice to it, he did it with seeds. And he took a seed and he put 3 seeds. He put 1 seed and he talked negatively towards it. And he took another seed and he talked nicely to it. And he took a 3rd seed and he said Tehillim, Psalms, with the seed. It turns out, according to this student, and again, he only did it once, so it's not really a scientific proof, but the seed which had negative talking didn't grow. The seed which had good talking grew, and the seed which had Psalms grew 5 times quicker, according to what this person said, than the one that spoke nicely to. Now, is this true? Is this not true? I got no idea, but that is on Google for everyone to see. Okay, that's what this student from Bar Ilan said. One more thing I'll talk about, I mean, I've got a lot to say, but I want to hear what Tali has to say, is when it comes to healing powers. So many cultures for a long time have been talking about water being a healing property. I know that they did some research on this. I found a 1999 experiment by a Harvard University professor. Her name was Dr. Cynthia Dorsey. She is the director of some sleep research program at one of the Massachusetts hospitals. And she found that if you have a steam bath, within 2 hours of going to sleep, she did this experiment on insomniacs, and she found that it was as good as sleeping pills, that there was a significant increase in how people slept after having some type of water in their system or a heated water system. I know it works for me. When I have a hot bath, I just sleep like a baby. I don't know if it works for everybody, but definitely we can see that there have been experiments done that water has healing properties. And these are just some of the concepts about water. I'll maybe end off with a few more concepts, just take it home in terms of the Jewish aspect. But one key aspect of water is it's a blessing on this world. There's no doubt about it that our life itself is contingent on water. Inside our bodies, we have 70% of water. If you take this Japanese professor's experiment, imagine what it means when you talk negatively to someone. And we know that it messes up the crystals in water under a Petri dish. Imagine if you're 70% water and people are speaking badly to you. What's going on in your chemical makeup of your water? That's something to think about as well. I know that the yogis in India go into these types of questions. But these are all conceptual questions. The major questions about water in this world is, how are we going to make sure that a resource like water stays for our children? How do we make sure that we are drinking healthy things and providing healthy things for societies? And that's why I've asked Tali to help us, because Tali has a lot of experience in this. So Tali, without further ado, I'd like to introduce yourself for a few minutes, and maybe share with everybody here, what experience you've had with water, and what are you currently involved in, if anything?
Okay. Well, okay. First of all, I'd just like to say that I'm not an expert, but I have had experience with water through the various things that I've done and studied. So I'm a town planner, and I have studied 1 or 2 other things, including environmental management. I thought this would provide a broader understanding of the built environment. So when I studied environmental management, as part of our final paper, we were commissioned by a large retailer to undertake an assessment of their fresh produce supply chain, and in particular, their water use within that fresh produce supply chain. And that brought up some very interesting issues about retail and fresh produce and the South African climate, and how it all has an influence on the products that we buy, and the decisions that need to be made at the sort of large retail level. So I can talk a little bit more about that later. But I also just wanted to add that as a town planner, I deal constantly with issues around the built environment and around settlement. And in particular, for me, it's interesting dealing with informal settlements and the impacts that, well, that any settlement has on water, but in particular, the relationship between water and informal settlements. So yeah, those are just some of the.
Thank you, Tali. So we'll get to some questions on retail and on the settlements. So I just want to say thank you for agreeing. I only gave Tali 1 day notice, everybody, by the way. I only found out about Tali yesterday, that she does town planning and that she's involved in, you know, this type of study. So thank you for agreeing. First question, recycled water. Is it healthy? How many times can you recycle water? Tell us about your experience in that.
Okay, so it's interesting that you were talking about water having sort of a spiritual quality and you know, assigning sort of personal qualities to it. You know, theoretically, you can recycle water, and you know, you can use water and then purify it and then reuse it again. So you know, we use water all the time, and if you get water, let's say from the municipal system, and it's you know, used for drinking, it sort of gets flushed down the drain, and you know, we then use it you know, to wash our hands, to flush the toilet, to wash dishes, and so on, to water the garden. But you know, it is reusable and it can be cleaned. So there is you know, a lot of examples of where water has been, sorry, just hold on a second.
No problem.
Okay. So, you know, what we might find not as palatable is that water that actually has been used in a sort of sewage system can actually be cleaned and then recycled to the point where it can be used for drinking water. Now, that's not happening at the moment in Cape Town. And it is done in countries like Singapore and Australia and Namibia. But you know, the idea of using and reusing water that's been used for other purposes for drinking, I don't know if you would find that palatable, if you sort of give it a spiritual kind of
nuance. Got you.
Nuance, yeah. So
but how many times, I mean, scientifically, does it go forever? Can you just keep recycling and recycling? It doesn't ever wear out?
So you can recycle it as many times as you like, as long as you've got the resources to purify it. The problem is you might need energy to purify it. You know, there are various ways that you can do that with ultraviolet light, with screens, with biological enzymes. You can run water through a wetland. So there are many ways to clean the water, and it depends what you want to use it for. But theoretically, you can reuse it and reuse it as long as you're taking out the impurities. Usually along the way, some water gets lost, it gets evaporated.
Okay, so that's good to know. You mentioned about the spiritual thing. You found that interesting. I was listening to a yogi. His name's Sadhguru, and he's very popular on YouTube. And he was saying how in India, a lot of the people there, they're very against drinking out of water fountains, because in their mind, you have to feel the water with your own hands. Like the old way in drinking India, you go to the river, you pick it up with both hands, and it's almost like you're saying a blessing on it when you're drinking. I don't know how in India they're going to be thinking about, it's estimated that 200 million people in India in the future are going to be scarce of water. So I don't think they're going to be able to just drink their water with their hands all the time. And they're going to have to recycle as well. But, I think that there's maybe preferences versus necessities when it comes to drinking water. Next question that I have for you is, you mentioned the impoverished settlements, or the settlements that you've looked at in terms of, city planning. I know that this is a big topic in Cape Town at the moment, people, making settlements, etc., and the city having to deal with that. What issues or what challenges are coming your way in terms of impoverished settlements and water?
Okay, so if you think about it, in Cape Town, probably 1 in 8 people live in an informal settlement.
Okay.
Essentially, that means living in a shack somewhere on land that they don't own, and different access to services, to that which we are used to. So water is normally supplied to them, if they're lucky, by the city through public taps. And that means that, and they have a policy that it's usually 1 tap for every 25 households. So a household can be between 2 and 4 people, or as many as they are. It's average 2.3. But actually, in some of the settlements that I've worked in, this ratio is higher. It's as much as 50 households per tap. In places like Kosovo and Philippines, which have a population density of something like 220 units per hectare, which is the equivalent to a block of flats, really, on the same piece of land, so tiny pieces of land. And yes, so access to water for many people is quite difficult. And if you think that to go and get your water, you would have to go and queue, to collect water from a tap, and then bring it home in a bucket to do your drinking and your washing. Sometimes, people will use that bucket for other things because they can only afford 1 bucket. So they might not want to use the toilet at night because it's also located, far away. And so they might use that bucket for the same purpose. And so there's all sorts of health problems that can, occur as a result of not having access to water. So, and also, I mean, when you speak of water, you always need to speak of sanitation in the same sentence. So, any solutions for water, also need to look at the issues of sanitation. And in Cape Town and in South Africa, we tend to have waterborne sewage. So we flush down our potable water when we go to the toilet. So I think people in Cape Town, when we went through this terrible drought, and realized that we were almost running out of water, and realized that we were actually flushing our drinking water down the toilet, I think a lot of people sort of stood back and started implementing measures to try and save water. But in a situation like this, an informal settlement, there isn't really that opportunity. And so upgrading of these settlements is a huge issue, and something that really must be seen as vital for society as a whole.
So I'm going to come back to retailers in a moment, but I just want to go on. You mentioned the buckets. So my next question that I had was, is there anything that the public can do about being more responsible about water or helping with water? The first thing that I thought is maybe people should be providing extra buckets to all these impoverished people if this is a big problem in water. Any other is that a good suggestion, or are there any other suggestions that you have in terms of, you know, us here in Muizenberg, or just in general, what should people around the world be thinking about to be responsible about water?
Well, I mean, there's what we can do in terms of the informal settlements, and then there's what we can do ourselves in terms of being responsible about water. As I said, anyone who has lived in Cape Town through this drought has now become an expert on ways to conserve water. And everyone made an enormous effort to use less water and save water. Ironically, people in the informal settlements, because they weren't paying for the water and they weren't going through the same type of, deprivation in terms of, well, they were going
their
through
usual life. Yeah.
they didn't experience it actually in the same way. But that being said, they actually are using far less water than the average household, because we use it for all sorts of things like irrigating our garden and, endless washing of clothes and so on. So people made an effort, I think, to save water. People introduced rainwater tanks to save the water, and try to store that. The problem is, because we're in a Mediterranean climate and we get a lot of water in winter and then almost no water in summer. You have a situation where your rainwater tank is overflowing, and you're sort of 2 weeks into summer and you've run out of any water that you've saved. So unless you have an enormous tank, that's not really going to help. But some people implemented that, it's probably best just to let the water run into your garden, so it sort of feeds the water table. In Cape Town, we have a water table that sits quite high. It's about 0.5 meter under the ground in summer, even closer in some cases. And a lot of people put in boreholes and then use that to supplement the water. And another thing is grey water. So grey water is basically water from taps, from washing hands, from the kitchen, that can then be reused for things like flushing toilets and irrigating your garden. Those kind of systems can be placed into a house. Obviously, there's an expense, but it's worthwhile doing in the long run.
I was going to ask you, Tali, on that note, is there anything happening at the city level or the government level to try and promote, are there any perks, tax perks, etc., trying to be more, fiscally smart, or I don't know what the word is, responsible when it comes to one's own water?
Yes. Okay, so I'm not an expert on that, on the water policy side of it. And I think that you'll find that most people have an opinion on whether the city of Cape Town has been good at implementing those policies. They have, during the drought, obviously increased the rates for water exponentially, so that people were forced to use it, to find ways of using it, because they found that actually in the when you do the sums, it actually worked out cheaper compared to the city's rates. There was an announcement yesterday that the city of Cape Town is going to be removing the restrictions from the 1st of November, but they're going to have just a tariff for everybody. Um, so, I mean, you know, there are carrots and sticks. They've also, with new buildings, you know, the city does demand that there is some kind of water saving measures put in place. So that's all policy that's kind of
Okay,
being.
good. I mean, I don't know if you saw it. Someone wrote here, Gilda wrote that she recommends that architectural schools and companies should be educating their staff or their people about not, about saving runoff and directing it into the ground, etc., etc. She posed it as a question, would this be possible? What do you think about that?
That's an
I guess it's
interesting.
possible. Yeah.
Yes, it's possible. And yes, I think there's been a huge shift in thinking around technologies and water saving, energy saving. I think it's very much at the forefront. And people at architectural schools are currently learning about it. It's certainly, when I was at archi school, wasn't something that was, you know, thought of. It was kind of thought of as alternative ways of thinking. Now it's very much mainstream, and in certainly with energy reduction, there are policies in place, and it's, you know, there's something called XA regulations, and energy is very much at the forefront, and I think water is going to be following soon with national building regulations.
Okay, good. Thank you. I've only got two questions left for you, Tali. Thank you. The first one is, with regards to the large retailers, you mentioned that you've worked with the retailers before in terms of how their water usage, in terms of their fresh vegetables and other things maybe. What do you recommend retailers to do to help the water scarcity problem?
So I just want to explain a little bit about the project. So, you know, it was concentrating on agriculture because agriculture uses about 84% of fresh water in South Africa. And most crops, you know, are irrigated. So that uses, I would say, of that, about 78% are actually using that sort of potable water. And because fresh produce uses a large portion of that, this retailer commissioned us to look at the water use that their farmers and suppliers were supplying, to see whether they could make a difference. And, you know, what we found was that the southwestern areas, obviously, of South Africa, and the northwest have got the highest risk in terms of water scarcity. So at the time, 30% of their suppliers were from the Western Cape. Western Cape is a big supplier of potatoes and grapes, wine, and you know, they actually had to start looking at, were these suppliers, you know, should they look exclusively at these suppliers? Should they start looking elsewhere? That was the one thing. The other thing was looking at the technology that the farmers were using. A lot of farmers were simply drawing from the rivers and then spray irrigating in the middle of the day. So, you know, that's when the highest rates of evapotranspiration in the middle of the day. Some of the farmers were using some Israeli technology, drip irrigation underground, and you know, that was sort of quite advanced. That was more for your higher end crops, like your wines and so on. So really it was about the retailer helping farmers with communication, knowledge about climate change and the impacts and what they could do in terms of technology, working with Department of Water Affairs to provide advice, and then considering crops that are more water resistant. So certain crops need more water, and then sort of looking at, okay, so are those the best ones to be using, or growing those higher water crops in areas where there is more water.
Very interesting. Wow. Last question that I have for you. I mean, I've got so many questions, but I'm going to ask you them individually. We don't have a lot of time here. because it's such an important thing that you're doing. In terms of cities, in terms of South Africa as a whole, and maybe in terms of the world as a whole, are you positive about how we'll be able to handle water problems in the future as a species called the human beings?
Well, that's a big question, Ryan.
Yeah.
I think you know, back in 99, they predicted that by 2025 we wouldn't have enough water in South Africa for our food production, our agriculture, our industry, our household needs. We're one of the 30 driest countries in the world, and we're practically a semi-desert. So unless we really start thinking about water and how we use water and get over our initial, sort of revulsion, I would say, with the thought of recycling, our sewage water, we're not going to get there unless we make this sort of mammoth effort. But I do believe that the human race is able to overcome these kind of issues through technological means or other means. So I think there is hope.
Good. Okay, well, Tali, I also believe so. And I believe it more now that you say it. So thank you for sharing with us. If anyone has any other questions about that, please write it in the chat and maybe we can ask Tali some questions. But I'm just going to continue with what I wanted to end off with, which is not practical, Tali. It's not as crucial on a macro level as what you're doing. Which is obviously, by the fact that retailers are looking at where they should grow their vegetables in terms of, how much water is used from which part of the country, that's a fantastic thing, in my opinion, that we've got to the stage where people are thinking about these types of things. And I'm just going to bring it more home to a personal level. So I was watching a TED Talk by a Chinese person who was saying that there's a book about water written 2,500 years ago. And he was drawing different lessons that this book held. And one lesson it said is, the fact that water travels from upwards towards downwards naturally, it always will go to the lowest point that it can, is trying to teach us something about humility. And by the fact that we are 70% water ourselves, it's trying to tell you that the majority of what you are should be towards humility. And I found that was a very, very fascinating thing. Another aspect that the book brought up is that water takes up any container or any space that it's put in. Not every element fits in everywhere else, but the molecules of water fit into the container that it's in. And again, water seems to suggest this idea of compromise, of being able to fit in wherever you are with the things around you. And again, if we are 70% water, that's almost an indication that the majority of us should be from a compromising position. It doesn't always mean that you have to compromise, and I'm not speaking very specifically about anything in particular, but just on the molecular level, this Chinese book was teaching us, and this is amazing, 2,500 years ago it was written, that water teaches us humility and compromise. Another thing that I noticed, this is not in that book, but I thought it's the word corollary. I forget it in method, but the kind of the same thing, but another way of looking at it is that water is has one of the highest boiling points, despite its small molecular weight. I was looking like in science, things similar to it have boiling points of like -4, 4, 14, and all of a sudden there's this jump. H2O has a boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius. And that also indicates to me that water is meant to be humble, flowing downwards. And to get it to go upwards, you require a lot of energy. So naturally, we should be trying to be humble. But, if we give in to our ego, whatever it is, that creates a lot of energy to go in that opposite direction. One or two other things just in terms of Judaism. The rabbis and the Torah itself has always viewed water as one of the most important resources we have. The Torah in many places says the expression mayim chayim, living waters. There's this mitzvah called going to the mikveh, and you immerse yourself in a body of water which is natural. And the Jewish law, the halakha, goes into differences. Is it stationary water? Is it moving water? How much does water move? Thanks, Gilda. I'll try to get you that name. I forgot it, but I'll try to get you that name. And it's amazing how different the rabbis already 2,000 years ago were already entertaining the idea that water changes its properties relative to if it's stationary, if it's moving. And I'm not talking about like bulhazi or anything like that. I'm talking on a spiritual level. Is it a good mikveh if the water is moving? So that's something that from the Torah it's indicating to us to think about. Tali, you mentioned Israel and technology. I was watching a few shows about Israel's technology in terms of water. Maybe you can verify this or not, but the one that I watched said that Israel is the most successful country in the world at recycling gray water. And it's by a long shot. According to this professor from Israel, and again, it's always biased because it's someone from Israel talking, but he said that Israel recycles 85% of its gray water, and the next country in the world is Spain with something like 25 or 30%. I can't even remember the exact amount. So that's amazing to see how Israel is doing that. Also, Israel has a $2.2 billion industry of exporting water know-how and water technology around the world. And this is from a country which is a desert, as you say. So I hope on a personal level, Tali, that South Africa and other countries can, look at Zion and see what they're doing, because I know that Israel's exporting water to Jordan and to other places. So I think that that's, something that we should be proud of in terms of Israel. At least that's something that I'm proud of. We mentioned the healing aspects. Another thing in terms of meditation, I know that a lot of the times they say that water flowing, they call it a white noise. It's one of those things that you can have in the background for meditation. Many Buddhists and others like to be, surrounded by small waterfalls or at least water flowing to help them with their meditation. And that's also an ancient thing. So there is something about water being around us in our surroundings, not just in our bodies. And then I think the last one that I'll talk about is the 75% that babies are born with, the body weight is highly water. And then as we get older, closer to our deaths, it gets smaller and smaller in our bodies. And that also indicates that, that water is life, that mayim chayim. We start off as babies with a lot of water, and as we grow older, we lose some of that water. And that's why we should really be taking care of the water, because really it is life. It not only allows us to live. I don't think a human being can go without water for more than 4 or 5 days, but it also, we can see it in everything, that it's 70% of the world, 70% of the planet, and we lose water as we get older. So thank you, Tali, for suggesting practical things and showing us where, in the short 20 minutes that you had, you definitely, I've already got comments from others saying that they learned things. So thank you very much for your, giving us your experience. And everybody just start thinking about water. One thing that I learned for sure is the next time I have a spare bucket, I know that someone else can gain a lot more from it than I can. So thank you for that suggestion. Thank you all for being here. Stay healthy.